What's up, YouTube? It's your boy Zaza Bald, and today I'm reacting to a video that discusses the Black family here in America throughout history. So, without further ado,
Jungle Beats, holla at me.
I share my screen. Let's get it. Let's get it.
One of the sad things is that we talk in this country as if slavery was something unique to the United States or to blacks and whites.
You say 1619 is as important as 1776.
The 1619 Project aims to reframe country's history, understand 1619 as true founding, place at center of story, the consequences of slavery, contributions of African Americans. Okay. The legacy of slavery in YT Magazine, 1619 Project draws connections to America today. Okay. Okay.
Yes. Our decision to buy that first group of 20 to 30 Africans would influence almost everything that would follow after. I think it is foundational. It is as foundational to who we became as a country as our decision in 1776 to break off from the British.
Recently, some school districts have decided that they'll be teaching a unit on early American history based on the New York Times 1619 Project, which illustrates how the founding of this country is inextricably tied to the institution of slavery.
I was never the biggest fan of Trevor Noah, but then I watched a Breakfast Club interview of him, and he was doing his thing. He seemed pretty chill. I don't know, just for me, I guess it was just he seems like a know-it-all kind of guy. And yeah, I felt like his voice and his British accent was actually kind of annoying. I usually like people with British accents, but I just found this kind of annoying. But yeah.
One of the sad things is that we talk in this country as if slavery was something unique to the United States or to blacks and whites. And in point of fact, slavery was one of the oldest institutions among human beings. They go back as far as there is recorded history. Archaeological finds suggest that slavery existed before human beings could read and write. So race, a racial difference between the slaves and the enslavers, that is a relatively new phenomenon. You didn't have in ancient times the ability to go to another continent and move millions of people of a different race across the ocean. So you enslaved the people who were nearby. The Europeans enslaved Slavs for centuries before they brought the first Black African to the Western Hemisphere.
Okay, but so you're not suggesting, you do not wish to say anything other than that slavery as practiced in the United States it may have been recent, but you'd be willing to grant that it was particularly perverse and destructive because race got mixed into it at that point, right?
Race got mixed into it in the United States more than anywhere else for a very simple reason. The United States was founded, as the Declaration said, of the independence, said all men are created equal. Right? If that's true, then the only way you can justify slavery is to say that some men are less than men.
I see. So the racial
but in Brazil, where Brazil imported more slaves than the United States, there was no such ideology. Brazil was not a democratic country. The whole issue never arose.
I see.
One of the most pervasive.
Go back. This is myth number 2. The high rate of fatherless family in the Black community is a legacy of slavery. Let's see what he has to say.
One of the most pervasive stereotypes about Black Americans is that of the absent Black father. Where does this toxic idea about Black fathers even come from? Well, one theory takes it back to a 1965 report titled The Negro Family, The Case for National Action. The report became...
Why is it always a white person speaking on Black issues? Let's get the hell out of here, random white woman. Please go sit down somewhere. You don't know what we go through. You don't know our experience.
became one of the most contentious political documents in 20th century America. Democrat and Assistant Secretary of Labor Daniel Patrick Moynihan put the report together to make the argument for how the Lyndon B. Johnson administration had to do more for racial equality than simply pass the Voting Rights Act. Moynihan argued that to really fight racial inequality, the government had to understand the state of Black communities and why they were the way they were. But Moynihan ended up focusing on one thing, the Black family. According to him, the fundamental reason for growing economic inequality between white and Black Americans was a crumbling family structure in Black communities. And at the foundation of the so-called crumbling Black family structure was the absent Black father. Moynihan looked at non-marital.
I see that. I see that. Yes. Yes.
Birth rates and rates of fathers living separately from their children and made a whole bunch of assumptions about parents' relationship statuses and parental involvement. The report didn't take into account factors like the legacy of slavery, generational wealth, or even economic migration in which men left their homes so that they could provide for their families.
A fallacy is that the current fatherless families so prevalent among contemporary Blacks are a legacy of slavery, where families were not recognized under slavery. This ignores the fact that the problem has become much worse among generations of Blacks far removed from slavery than among generations closer to the era of slavery, close quote. Explain that.
I mean, explain why it is so, or
Yeah, see,
explain-
why is that? Why, what on earth is going on there? That is so counter to what we assume.
Well, first,
That white guy, I hate his face. I hate his face. He's so, he explain, like, God, I hate him, bro.
first of all, the people, most people have not recognized the fact that that if you go back into the 20s, you find that married couple families were much more prevalent among Blacks then than today. Most Black kids grew up in homes with two parents under slavery itself and for generations thereafter. And as late as the 1960s, most Black children grew up in two-parent homes. When you think about it, I mean,
So that actually is true. When you look at history, directly after slavery during the Reconstruction era, there were families who were separated, but as time passed and Black families were able to get back together, the fathers were actually in the homes, and this is because families wanted to stick together, because like as Black folks, we were all we had during the Reconstruction era and like, you know, during the Jim Crow era and during the early 20th century. You know, like whites segregated us. So it was like, yo, like you had to stick with your people. You couldn't go to anything that was white owned. You know what I mean? You stuck to your neighborhood, you stuck to your community. And so like this is even evidence like in my own family. Like I'm in the Baldwin family, you know what I mean? Like my grandma was born in 1950 and she grew up with her other 5 siblings and they both had 2 parents in the household, right? She had her mom and her dad in the household, right? And right by the time she started having children, like during like the late 60s and the 70s, when liberal laws began to be passed and like a lot of liberalism began to take place, she actually was a single mother. And then it's funny because like all 3 of her children, all 3 of her daughters, they were single mothers. And my mother was a single mother. My aunts were both single mothers. And then like thereon and thereforth, like I just noticed like that in my family, it was always single mothers for generations thereafter. It was like there were never really a father figure in the family. You know what I mean?
I mean, centuries of slavery and generations of Jim Crow did not destroy the Black family, but one generation of the welfare state did. Moynihan was excoriated for pointing this out.
1965, the Moynihan report. That's right,
Yes.
the Moynihan report.
What is so people that took this as a way of putting down Blacks. What they don't understand was that one, Moynihan was a scholar who knew that his own group, the Irish Americans, had that very same problem at the beginning of the 20th century. And more importantly, Moynihan's own father deserted the family when he was 10 years old.
Oh, I didn't know that.
He and his brother were out shining shoes in Times Square and Central Park to try to bring in a few pennies to help keep the house going. And so where they'd been living in this wonderful suburban area, suddenly they were in a very rough neighborhood and they were shining shoes in Times Square to try to make ends meet. And so he understood that this was one heck of a problem that people should be warned about. And he was simply excoriated.
liberal policies lifted blacks out of poverty? This is interesting.
Black Americans, a group often identified as beneficiaries of the welfare state in America, made considerable economic progress in the 20th century. Fine, of course, but much, if not most. This is the thing with you. The dependent clause is where the sting is.
Kind of true. You know, you saw Black Wall Street back then in the 20s and I believe early 30s. I think it was in the 20s until white folks got jealous and burned us down. But continue.
But much, if not most, of this progress was prior to the massive expansion of the American welfare state, close quote. That is so I want to say counterintuitive because we hear so much about African-American progress and civil rights and the establishment of the welfare state that it really has become a kind of American intuition. Explain yourself, Dr. Sowell.
Well, as of 1940, 87% of Black households were in poverty. Over the next 20 years, that declined to 47%. This is all prior to the civil rights laws, prior to the social welfare policies of the Johnson administration. Over the next 20 years, it fell an additional 18 points. But that was just the same trend continuing at a reduced rate. Affirmative action is even worse. Poverty rate was something like 30% among Black households before affirmative action. And a decade after affirmative action, it was 29%. This is not the same as the 40% decline that occurred before there were any civil rights laws and before there was any social welfare state.
Okay, all right, whatever. I gotta process that. Myth 4, the discrimination in the past prevented Blacks from succeeding. Ooh, this is juicy.
Race and discrimination, you suggest, are not so closely linked that they move up and down together. First of all, distinguish the two, race and discrimination.
Racism is an attitude inside people's heads.
Right.
Discrimination is an overt act taking place outside in the real.
Racism is an attitude in people's heads. My guy, my man, there's literal systems in place that stop me as a Black man from being able to, or at least there were systems in place that were stopping my ancestors from, like, you know, buying homes, redlining, you know, from using white banks, from going to white restaurants. Like, literally, like, what are you talking about? And that legacy still carries out over in today. And yeah, it is apparent in people's attitudes today, but I still think that, like, white supremacy is kind of like a system that holds us back today.
The world.
Okay.
So not only with Black people, you find the same thing with Jews in previous centuries, that part of the United States where there was the most racism against Blacks, namely the South,
right,
is where Black construction workers were much more common than they were in the North, right on into the 20th century. And most people aren't aware that in the South, Blacks were the construction workers. I remember a professor at Howard University saying that when he was a boy in the South, his father pointed to some man on the street and said, he was the first first white construction worker in this town.
And so what was going on there? The racism did not, so whites could think of Blacks as somehow or other separate, but they'd still employ them because the market made it profitable to do so.
Yeah, in fact, yes. In fact, a lot.
My man, first of all, your face, bro. Your face. Second of all, that's not actually true. Like I was just saying, with Jim Crow laws, employment was always a barrier for folks in the 20s, 30s, and 40s, because they just couldn't get jobs at white-owned companies. No, like, all right, for example, a Black man would walk into a store and be like, hey, I'm trying to get a job here at the supermarket. And they're like, no, we don't employ Blacks. So what are you talking about, bro? Fix your face, your ugly ass face.
All had to be passed to stop this, because in the 20s, and particularly as the Depression got underway, Black construction companies in the South using Black non-union labor would come up to the North and underbid on government contracts, taking them away. And so this was very common, to the point where they passed the Davis-Bacon Act which said that on government contracts, you must pay the prevailing wage, which translated almost invariably into the union wage.
Right. So your point on the distinction between racism and discrimination is, don't worry about racism. It's inside people's heads. You can't measure it. There's a strongly subjective, just forget about it. Concentrate only on discrimination. And the best answer to discrimination is to let markets operate, because then people will discover, it will tend to militate against discrimination.
yeah.
When
What? Yo, no, I can't. Yo, do you see him right now? Forget about it. I'll continue.
When people have skills to offer, they'll be employed. Whatever this notion of racism in people's heads is, don't worry about that. Is that right?
Yeah.
Yo, I can't with this white dude, man. I can't, bro. Nah.
What I'm saying essentially is that racists may prefer one race to another, but they prefer themselves to everybody else.
So they'll do what's profitable.
That's right. That's right.
It would be very hard, for example, for a basketball owner, no matter how racist he was, to try to operate without blacks.
As you showed in the case of the Washington Redskins.
Yes, because there they had a policy of trying to keep blacks off the team for a long time. And it so happened that almost all the leading running backs of that era were black. And of course, as the Washington Redskins began to lose more and more games, it wasn't very long before they decided they had better get Bobby Mitchell from Cleveland and put him in the lineup as they did.
Wow. Yeah. Yo. All right, YouTube. Peace.